Light and darkness, creation and destruction, peace and terror. We're used to imagining God as a gentle force, comforting, forgiving, a steady presence in hard times. But think of the last time life shattered you, the loss that made no sense, the pain that felt personal, the moment everything fell apart, and the silence that followed felt like betrayal. We call these tests of faith, but what if there's something deeper? What if the chaos isn't God's failure? What if it's God's face? Not the absence of the divine, but its most raw, untamed presence. It's not just in ancient texts, it's in the rage of Yahweh in the Old Testament. It's in Kali's terrifying beauty, goddess of destruction wearing a necklace of skulls. It's in the Greek gods who bless and curse in the same breath. It's in Job's suffering, in Abraham's near sacrifice, in Jesus' cry on the cross. Even Carl Jung described it, the dark night of the soul, when the spirit feels swallowed by something vast and unknown. And maybe it's in your own life, in that 3 a.m. moment when nothing makes sense, in the heartbreak that's cracked you open, in the stillness that wasn't peace, but a kind of holy devastation. This version of God doesn't fit on a greeting card, but maybe it's more honest. And maybe somehow it's still love, just not the kind we ask for. The kind that doesn't coddle, but transforms. Welcome to Mantis Library, where we explore the divine in all its light and all its shadow. We've all been there, praying for help and getting silence, asking for a sign and getting chaos instead. Françoise O'Kane, in her book Sacred Chaos, asks the question we're all afraid to voice. What if God isn't just the comfort, but also the crisis? This isn't about good God versus bad God. It's about recognizing that the divine works in ways that don't always feel divine. That breakup that destroyed you might have been making space for something better. That job loss that felt like a punishment could have been pushing you towards your real purpose. O'Kane shows how every spiritual tradition knows this secret. The Bible's God who parts seas and sends floods, Hindu Kali who destroys while creating, the dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism. These aren't contradictions, they're the full picture we rarely see. Like a forest fire that looks like destruction but actually helps new growth. She talks about something called God's shadow. And before your mind runs off to horror movie territory, let's clear this up. The shadow isn't about evil or punishment. It's about the parts of God we usually don't talk about. The hard, wild, confusing moments where God doesn't feel gentle or fair. You know that moment when you're praying your heart out, doing everything right, and life still smacks you in the face. That's the space O'Kane is pointing to. That's where the shadow lives. She's saying that many of us secretly wonder, maybe the chaos in our lives isn't a sign that God's gone missing. Maybe it's actually where God is. In her words, to meet God in the darkness is to meet God without the safety net. It sounds scary, because it is, but it's also incredibly honest. She's not offering easy answers. She's saying, what if the chaos itself is sacred? It's a radical shift from the God we usually imagine. You know, the one who rewards the good, punishes the bad, and keeps things in neat moral order. But O'Kane pulls from traditions that tell a different story. In the Old Testament, God doesn't just hand out blessings. He brings floods, plagues, and commands that make you pause. In Exodus 20:21, it says, Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Not a glowing light, not a peaceful garden. Thick darkness. That line alone flips everything upside down. Because if Moses found God in the dark, maybe we can too. And then there's Kali, the fierce goddess of Hinduism. She wears a necklace of skulls, dances in cemeteries, and still people worship her with devotion. Why? Because she destroys what no longer serves. She breaks illusions. She tears through ego. In her chaos, there's truth. There's freedom. O'Kane draws on that same idea. Sometimes God doesn't come to comfort us. Sometimes God comes to shake everything loose. And this isn't just some abstract mythological concept. You've probably lived it. Think of that time you thought your life was finally on track, and then something happened. You lost someone. You failed. You got sick. And suddenly, all your prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling. You felt alone. Maybe you even thought, why would God let this happen? That's the shadow. Not because God abandoned you, but because something deeper was unfolding. Something that wasn't about answers, but transformation. O'Kane calls this sacred chaos. She's saying the mess isn't meaningless. It's part of how things grow. Think about a forest fire. It looks like total destruction. But after, the soil becomes rich. New life begins. It's painful, but it's also real. Life is like that. We don't always get a rescue. Sometimes we get stripped down. But in that stripping, something changes. We stop pretending. We stop performing. We start seeing what's real. And this connects us to something mystics have said for centuries. Pseudo-Dionysius talked about divine darkness, that God is so beyond us, so huge, that we can't even understand with words. Sometimes the only way to meet God is to let go of everything we thought we knew. Meister Eckhart famously said, I pray God to rid me of God. It sounds wild, but what he meant was, rid me of the version of God I made up. The one who always agrees with me, always acts how I expect. Because that God, that's just me in a robe. Real faith, the kind O'Kane is pointing to, doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like being lost. But maybe being lost is part of the path. Maybe the collapse is necessary. In chapter 2, she writes, the shadow is not God's absence. It is the mystery of presence in a form we don't yet understand. That line hits, especially when you're in the middle of something you can't fix or explain. And let's be real, this version of God won't win a popularity contest. We like neat stories. We want to believe that if we do good, good things will happen. But life doesn't always work that way, and deep down, we know it. O'Kane isn't trying to sell a feel-good religion. She's inviting us into a raw, unfiltered spirituality that makes room for grief, confusion, and rage. Not as spiritual failures, but as spiritual experiences. If you've ever cried on the bathroom floor and whispered, where are you? You've already been in conversation with God's shadow. If you've ever felt numb or furious or totally disorientated, that's not you drifting away. That might be the exact place where something real can begin. O'Kane isn't saying the pain is good. She's saying it might be holy. That the parts of life you thought were broken beyond repair might be the doorway to something deeper. This idea that the chaos isn't separate from God, but a part of him, isn't about giving up or becoming cynical. It's about letting go of the illusion of control. It's about allowing life to be as complex and wild as it actually is. And it's about trusting that even in the moments when everything feels ruined, there's still something sacred happening beneath the surface. Now let's talk about the psychological side of all this. Specifically, what Carl Jung had to say about the shadow and how Françoise O'Kane builds on that concept. If you've ever sat with your thoughts and wondered why you sometimes act in ways that surprise or scare even you, you've met your own shadow. Jung's idea of the shadow wasn't just some spooky corner of the mind. It's all the stuff we push down and pretend isn't there. The fear, the anger, the jealousy, the selfishness. The parts we don't want to show at dinner parties. So what does that have to do with God? Well, a lot actually. Jung said, to confront a person with their shadow is to show them their own light. Meaning we can't actually grow or evolve unless we face the dark parts we've been avoiding. Now take the same idea and apply it to how we see God. Most of us grow up with this idea of a perfect, all-loving, all-knowing deity who fits neatly into a Sunday school poster. But life doesn't always reflect that version. Sometimes we get hit with grief, betrayal, disaster, and suddenly the God we thought we knew feels like a stranger. O'Kane taps into this discomfort and goes, yes, that's the shadow. Think of it this way. If we project all our ideals onto God, perfect love, justice, protection, then what happens when we encounter the opposite? When our prayers go unanswered? When tragedy hits innocent people? That's where the repressed parts of our image of God start to show up. The disappointment, the confusion, even the anger. And O'Kane, much like Jung, invites us not to run from that, but to explore it. Because maybe this so-called dark side of God isn't evil, it's just unfamiliar. It's the side we haven't learned how to hold yet. This connects us with something Jung wrestled with in Answer to Job. That book isn't light reading, but the core idea is wild and kind of freeing. Jung says that even God evolves, that in the story of Job, where God allows Satan to destroy a faithful man's life, God himself is confronting his own shadow. Job doesn't do anything wrong, and yet suffers deeply. And Jung reads that story not as divine cruelty, but as a moment of divine self-awareness. He says, the innocent one is needed to bring God's own darkness to consciousness. What a thought. That suffering might not be pointless, but part of a much deeper process of spiritual integration for both humans and the divine. And let's be honest, we've all had moments like that, times when everything falls apart and we think, this is it, it's over, and then somehow, in the rubble, something new begins, a new direction, a deeper understanding, maybe even a peace we didn't know we could feel. It doesn't happen right away. Sometimes it takes months, even years. But O'Kane's point is that the divine might actually be in that rubble, not hiding behind the chaos, but working through it. Which brings us to one of the hardest parts of this whole idea, divine absence. What about those moments when God really does feel gone? When you're not just confused, but abandoned? When you cry out and hear nothing back? This isn't a modern crisis, it's ancient. The theologians had a name for it, Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Martin Luther talked about this, saying that sometimes God hides himself, not because he is cruel, but because his presence would be too much for us. And O'Kane echoes this. She doesn't dismiss those moments of silence or distance. She treats them as sacred too. Even Jesus experienced it. On the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's not a metaphor. That's the deepest, rawest moment of abandonment imaginable. And if even Christ could feel that, then maybe our own feelings of abandonment don't mean we're broken or failing. They mean we're human. They mean we're in a sacred chaos where something beyond us is unfolding. Françoise O'Kane doesn't try to clean this up. She doesn't slap a bow on it and say, everything happens for a reason. Instead, she holds the tension. She allows for the idea that the divine isn't always comforting, but it's always present, even in forms we don't recognize. She writes, "To meet God in the shadow is to be stripped of certainty, but not of connection." That's hard to hear, but it's also freeing, because it means you don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to be okay all the time to be spiritual. You don't have to smile through grief or dress up your doubt. You just have to show up, honest, broken, confused. That's where the real connection happens. And maybe that's the point. Not to build a perfect life where nothing goes wrong, but to build a faith that can hold us when it does. A faith that doesn't require us to hide the hard parts. A faith that sees God not just in the comfort, but in the collapse. Because, as O'Kane says, the shadow is not God's absence. It is the mystery of presence in a form we don't yet understand. And here's where things get really interesting. If God has a shadow, if the divine shows up in chaos, then maybe the big question of why does evil exist shifts entirely. Maybe the issue isn't whether God allows suffering or causes it, but how to relate to it. O'Kane doesn't try to explain suffering away with easy answers. She doesn't say, everything happens for a reason, in that hollow, dismissive tone that tries to shut people up. She says, sit with it, ask what it's revealing. Pain, she suggests, is not the absence of God. It is often the only place where we are raw enough to hear him. What O'Kane does so brilliantly is reframe the question entirely. Instead of asking, why would God let this happen? She asks, what if this is where God meets us in a way we've never seen before? It's not about spiritualizing abuse or justifying harm. It's about widening our understanding of the sacred to include the dark, the confusing, the heartbreaking. As she writes, the divine is not always what saves us. Sometimes it's what undoes us so we can start again. This way of seeing changes everything. It means our breakdowns aren't spiritual failures, they're invitations. It means we don't have to hide our doubts. We can speak them, cry them, scream them if we need to. Because sacred chaos doesn't require us to be neat. It requires us to be honest. And honesty, especially spiritual honesty, is rare and powerful. In the end, O'Kane isn't offering a new rulebook or a set of doctrines. She's offering a shift in perception, a way of seeing the sacred not only in beauty, but in brokenness, not only in peace, but in struggle. It's not an easy path, but it's a real one. And maybe when everything else falls apart, real is what we need most. As she writes in one of the most striking lines of the chapter, to walk with God in the light is easy. To trust God in the dark, that is faith. That's what sacred chaos is really about. Not fixing the chaos, not escaping it, but finding God within it. And that, more than any comforting platitude, is what gives us the courage to keep going. Because if God can be found even in the shadow, then maybe we're never truly alone. Not in the hospital room, not in the heartbreak, not in the silence after the prayer. Maybe the shadow isn't something to fear. Maybe it's the beginning of a deeper kind of knowing. One that doesn't require answers, just presence. Just the willingness to stay and to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the sacred lives. And if you like this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious, stay mindful, and never stop exploring. We'll see you again in Mantis Library.